Welcome, thanks for joining us today. Decisions. One of those things that we all encounter. There's times where big decisions have to be made. Sometimes they're forced on us. Other times we might get an idea that we have to decide about. But have you faced any big decisions recently, Brooke?
I'm trying to work my way through getting information in order to be able to make a big decision. That's pretty big. And
research?
Yeah, a little bit like finding people to talk to and actually asking questions, and then actually looking at what's going on for family and all those sorts of things, and trying to figure out whether or not it's actually the right step to take or whether it's a wait moment.
Yep. We were talking before about what makes a big decision, and often there's more at stake, or like you were saying there, more moving elements.
Yeah.
It's complicated, but if it's going to cost us something, or it's going to be a change in our future, or choosing schools for your kids,
Yeah.
choosing how you're going to spend your money, where to live, these things are...
Breakfast is a hard decision most mornings.
Sometimes. Often we might feel like we just coast along and hope our decisions will make themselves, but I think there's a time where we do need to step in, and we can really change things if we decide proactively.
So recently I changed my job, and it was quite an anguishing experience, and so I spent some time writing out the pros and the cons so that I could make a rational, logical evaluation, but also so it wasn't rushed. I spent some time in silence, just meditating and contemplating on where I am and where I was going to go, and ensuring that wherever I landed was going to align with my values and where I wanted to go and what I felt was the right thing to do. So yeah, making a list and just not rushing things, spending time in silence to get some clarity is probably the two things that I would do.
When evaluating if a decision was the right one or not, often we look at how well it's going. Is it are we feeling good about it, or are things going smoothly? When sometimes I think it's not always the case that a good decision will have an easy outcome.
Yeah, that's true.
Like I changed my work recently, and it's been disruptive and not easy, but somehow I think it's still the right decision.
Yeah.
Can you relate at all?
Yeah, I think, when we do have to make transitional seasons happen, we're going to naturally face that I'm not entirely comfortable. I don't know exactly how I'm responding here to this situation, and some of the, I guess, the rote responses that we might have had in the past to, that's just the way this works. We have to actually make, I suppose, a few extra decisions about how we're actually going to view an emotional moment, or how we're going to, because tensions flare, don't they, when we're in a season of change? Like, everybody's a bit more kind of raw and vulnerable, and so there's extra patience needed and things like that. So yeah, I think you're right. Like, it's not always smooth sailing when you put a new thing in place.
Which makes sense then why our default is usually, let's just leave things as they are, and hopefully things will work out, and put off decision making. Let the decision be made by default.
Yes.
We just carry on until the decision's made for us.
Because at least then too, if there is tension, maybe then we don't feel quite so responsible for the tension. If the decision's been made for us, then all of a sudden we just go, well, we had no choice.
So sometimes decisions have to be made. Brooke, anything you've learned about making decisions?
I think picking everything doesn't necessarily work. You're at the grocery store, you think, I'll pick every variety, that'll be fine. No, that doesn't work. You end up with a full pantry. So I think, jokes aside, figuring out what are my values helps me a little bit, because if I know what I value, if something then just is totally against that, well, then I know that I'm not going to be happy if I take that path.
If we're acting on our values, even if it doesn't turn out well, we probably would have still gone that way anyway. And it really simplifies the process and takes the pressure off a bit.
Yeah, we'll learn more about our values, I suppose, if we actually, even if it doesn't turn out to be the way that we actually wanted it to go, it will actually still be a learning journey, won't it? That will help us to figure out our values even more. And then the other thing is just really checking to see if the people around you have any kind of advice or any kind of insight into how you operate when you're under stress
True.
or whatever, if it was a stressful kind of possibility.
I love to go and get advice and listen to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Not always agreeing or following necessarily exactly what they say, but
Yeah.
it does help if we listen carefully,
Yeah.
help us figure it out.
Yeah,
that
and
process.
maybe framing a question. You know, what has been your experience with this, rather than what do you think I should do? Maybe even that little.
That's true.
Just protection for self in terms
Yep.
of making sure that you're not actually saying I'm going to do what you what you advise. I don't know, because
That's true.
we have to be able to say thank you for your help, but if it's not going to match your values, then you still have to have the freedom to be able to choose.
Yes, everyone's on their
Yeah.
own journey.
Yeah.
And I try and listen beyond what they're saying to where they've come from.
Yeah.
Often that colours what they're saying and their opinions.
Yeah.
If they've been hurt in the past, for example,
Yeah.
that can come through in their views.
Yeah, for sure.
It might not be something that necessarily applies
Yeah.
in all cases.
Yeah.
Choosing can be more complicated today just because of the number of options out there. I remember, it's not a big decision, but the first bed we got when we got married, we walked into a shop. There was a limited number of choices. We'd got one, but now we've had to replace it, and so we looked online and thought, oh yeah, there's a mattress, but then all the ads start coming up, all these other choices, just too many similar things, and you start, oh, this one's slightly cheaper, seems slightly better, and then you get in that spiral of,
Yeah.
I can't choose.
What do they call that? Analysis paralysis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes in that circumstance, to sell things, you made promises that just aren't true. Where can we see that the outcome isn't really going to live up to the promise?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I mean, let's face it, if someone's asking for your money, very often it's not always going to be quite so shiny as the promise. So that's tricky. But I was thinking back to the fact that, I think in a previous episode you've said something about story, and story being used to sell us things. And I think that's because it really taps into our emotional center. And when we're in our emotional center, sometimes things happen quicker than
Yes.
we would otherwise. So, we might open the wallet to spend money on that thing that we wouldn't have if our emotions weren't in that spot.
Yes.
So maybe
you're
just-
right. Not
just-
rushing into things,
Yeah,
taking a
slower.
step back, calming yourself, and then, do I still really think this is the decision to make?
Yeah, and and we see it, because probably we make financial decisions so much. What am I going to buy? I see that thing, I want it now. And it's so many of the financial advisors sort of say, just pause. If you still want it, like in 24 hours or in a week or in a month, then go back and get it. But if the urge passes, then maybe it's not really what you wanted. But how do we then transfer that into our, our day-to-day management of life, like how we're going to spend our time,
Yes.
or how we're going to, plan for holidays or whatever.
Yeah, you were talking about values before, and that's an inner thing that we've got to sort out. Similar is motivation.
Yeah.
Looking at the motivation for a decision. If you go back, take a few steps back, why? Asking why am I choosing this? I think that can reveal really what's behind it.
Yeah.
And when it's coming from a decision's coming from a good and settled place,
Yeah.
it often turns out better than when there's something in there that we haven't quite worked through.
Yeah. The voice of peace is actually quite patient. The voice of hurry usually isn't looking after us. The voice of hurry is usually taking us to a rash decision or a rash kind of
Yes.
thing. Sometimes there are emergencies, and we're not talking about that, but if it doesn't need to be an urgent decision, yes, you want to make your decision in good time, but maybe not hurry it.
Was a union bloke for about 33 years as a shop steward on the job, and I found that I only needed to know what I needed to know to do the job, and quite often miracles happened in that I would be going along to the same workplace where I'd been for years, and when I walked onto the job, somebody that I hadn't seen for months would come up and say something to me, and I would say, oh yes, and I wouldn't think anything about it. And then maybe 2 or 3 hours later, the manager would call me into the office and would say something that related to the information that I just received, and he would think I knew a lot more than I did.
I think there's an element where God can work in things despite us.
Yeah, and even like sometimes we might even want to make a decision, but there might be others around us who are not ready for us to make that decision yet. And we don't even really have to be bitter about that. We can actually just go patiently and keep prayerful. If we really feel that we want to go in a particular direction, but it's just not the right time yet, then if we travel through that with prayer, there's always good things to be found in that.
Yes, and the journey of discovering more about ourselves in that process.
Yeah.
It's almost like there's never a wasted decision if we're willing to stick with it and to work it out as we go.
Yeah, for sure.
So thank you for joining us. Feel free to continue to observe, but get to know us as well. Leave us a comment with questions and feedback. I'd love to hear it. We've got Zoom calls throughout the week. You can see them on our website. Also, if you want to explore this topic a little bit further, we've got a podcast that sort of addresses this on a slightly different angle, and that's in the description. You can find the details about that. But good to see you, and we'll see you next week.